That book belongs in a private collection, not in the hands of someone who can't afford to be here." The words cut through the elegant murmur of the auction house like a blade. Heads turned. Crystal glasses paused mid-sip. The elderly man in the worn tweed jacket stood frozen, his weathered hand still outstretched toward the ornate first edition. In his faded leather satchel lay an envelope containing his life savings, impressive for a retired teacher perhaps, but laughable in this room of billionaires and heiresses. What he couldn't know was that among the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns, Leonardo DiCaprio had stopped his conversation, his attention now fixed entirely on the unfolding scene. The Blackwell private auction house glittered with old money and new celebrities. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across marble floors where the elite of New York circulated with practiced nonchalance. The book in question, a rare first edition of The Great Gatsby, sat on its illuminated pedestal, its starting price of $280,000 displayed on the digital board. Martin Thorne, who had taught that very novel to high school students for 43 years, stood out painfully in his decades-old suit. The auctioneer, Philip Harrington III, adjusted his bow tie with manicured fingers, exchanging knowing glances with security personnel who had already begun moving toward the old teacher. "Sir, perhaps you've wandered into the wrong venue," Harrington said, his voice dripping with rehearsed politeness that barely masked contempt. "This is a private event for registered bidders only." Around them, polite titters rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered about letting in the help. Martin's face flushed deep red, but his voice remained steady as he explained, "That book was stolen from my classroom during a break-in 15 years ago. My students had signed it for me upon my retirement." He reached again for the leather-bound treasure, unaware that DiCaprio had set down his champagne and was now moving purposefully through the crowd. Security guards in black suits approached Martin from both sides, their movement drawing more attention than their discretion intended. The elderly teacher didn't notice them, his eyes fixed on the book that represented the culmination of his life's work. Each year for 4 decades, he had guided teenagers through Fitzgerald's masterpiece, watching understanding dawn in their eyes as they grasped the novel's critique of wealth without substance. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him. "I have documentation," Martin said, his voice stronger now as he reached into his worn satchel. His fingers trembled slightly as he produced a yellowed newspaper clipping and what appeared to be a police report. "The break-in was documented in the local paper. This book has 38 signatures from my final class at Westridge High. They pooled their money to buy it for me." Philip Harrington's lips curled into what approximated a smile, but conveyed only disdain. How touching. However, this item has a clear provenance through 3 private collections since 2009. Whatever sentimental value you attach to it is irrelevant to its current legal status. He gestured subtly to the security personnel. "Please escort this gentleman to the exit. We have serious collectors waiting." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but most simply returned to their conversations, the momentary disruption already forgotten. A woman in diamonds worth more than Martin's house laughed loudly at something her companion said, the sound cutting through the tension like a reminder of which world belonged here and which did not. "I've saved for 15 years, Martin persisted, his dignity intact, despite the flush of humiliation coloring his cheeks. "I may not look like your usual clientele, but I have $127,000. It's everything I have." He held the envelope forward as if its contents might somehow validate his existence in this space. The amount he named caused several nearby people to exchange glances, some amused, some embarrassed on his behalf. Harrington's laugh was practiced, gentle enough to seem polite, sharp enough to wound. "The starting bid is $280,000, sir. Even if you were a registered bidder, which you are not, your savings wouldn't qualify you to participate. He turned to address the room with theatrical flair. Now, if we could proceed without further interruptions, I believe everyone deserves to be heard. The voice that cut through the tension wasn't loud, but it carried a weight of quiet authority that commanded attention. Conversations stopped, heads turned. Leonardo DiCaprio stood just a few feet away, his expression thoughtful as he studied the elderly teacher. The actor wasn't known for making scenes at public events, which made his intervention all the more powerful. He moved with casual confidence to stand beside Martin, not touching him but clearly aligning himself with the older man through proximity. "I'd be interested to hear more about this book's history," DiCaprio continued, addressing Martin directly, while the entire room hung on his words, "especially if it contains the authentic impressions of students who found meaning in Gatsby." The room's atmosphere transformed instantly. Phones appeared in hands, discreetly angled to capture whatever might unfold. Harrington's professional composure wavered momentarily before he regained his practiced smile, now directed at DiCaprio with considerable more warmth. "Mr. DiCaprio, it's an honor to have you with us tonight. Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately after the auction." He gestured toward the waiting security guards, who now stood uncertainly, caught between their instructions and the presence of a global celebrity. "I think now works better," DiCaprio replied, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Books like Gatsby aren't just collectibles. They're vessels for ideas that continue to resonate." He turned to Martin with genuine interest. "You taught this novel for 40 years?" 43, Martin corrected, standing straighter now. The tremor in his hands had stopped. In the presence of someone who actually wanted to hear him, his dignity returned fully. "I watched 3 generations of students discover that wealth without purpose leads to emptiness. Some of those students went on to become doctors, teachers, even a Pulitzer finalist." DiCaprio nodded thoughtfully. Around them, the room had become utterly silent. The elite attendees, who moments before had been dismissing Martin, now watched with rapt attention, their expressions recalibrating as they processed this unexpected association between the shabby teacher and the environmental activist movie star worth hundreds of millions. "I played Gatsby in 2013, DiCaprio said, addressing the room now. "I spent months trying to understand a character who believed material wealth could fulfill his deepest longings. It seems to me that someone who helped young people understand the true message of this book might have more right to it than someone who sees it as merely an investment." Harrington's professional smile had hardened into something brittle as he assessed the situation. This was no longer about removing an unwanted intruder, but navigating a potential PR disaster or opportunity. A glance at his wealthy clientele confirmed they were captivated by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. "While Mr. DiCaprio's interest is certainly noted," Harrington said, his tone recalibrated to include a hint of deference toward the actor, "we must respect the integrity of our auction process. This item has been properly authenticated and consigned." He turned to address the broader room. "Perhaps we could advance the bidding on lot number 47 to accommodate our unexpected guests." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several attendees nodded in agreement, eager to see where this unusual situation might lead. A few others frowned, displeased by the disruption to tradition. A tall woman in a designer gown whispered audibly to her companion, "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" DiCaprio caught the comment and shook his head. "No stunt. Just an interesting convergence of values." He gestured toward Martin. "Here's a man who taught the message of Gatsby to generations, that wealth without meaning is hollow, and he's being dismissed by the very system Fitzgerald critiqued." Phones recorded discreetly from every angle now. The story was too perfect. Leonardo DiCaprio, who had portrayed Gatsby himself, defending an elderly teacher in a room full of precisely the type of wealth-worshipping elite that the novel criticized. The irony was lost on no one. "I believe Mr. Thorne deserves to participate," DiCaprio continued, "and I'm curious about a book that inspired 43 years of passionate teaching." Martin stood a little straighter, his weathered hand gripping the envelope containing his life savings. The dignity with which he carried himself despite his humble appearance began to register with some of the guests. A few shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing themselves through new eyes, as characters in a Fitzgerald novel rather than as its rightful owners. "If I may," Martin said, his voice steady now with DiCaprio beside him, "this isn't about money for me. This book contains messages from students who found their voice through literature. To them, and to me, it's priceless." Harrington cleared his throat, reasserting control over the situation. "Very well. As a special accommodation, we'll allow Mr. Thorne to register as a bidder." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable as he added, "Though I must remind everyone that the starting bid remains at $280,000. A pointed reminder that Martin's life savings of $127,000 would be insufficient. DiCaprio studied the auctioneer for a moment before turning to Martin. "Tell me about those student signatures. What makes them special?" The elderly teacher's eyes lit up with memories. Each signature comes with a note about what they learned. Melissa Winters wrote that Gatsby taught her that love without honesty is just possession. She's a family court judge now. His voice strengthened as he continued. Thomas Reed wrote that he finally understood the difference between having wealth and being valuable. He founded a literacy program in our district that's helped thousands of children. As Martin spoke, something remarkable happened. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Several of the wealthy attendees lowered their phones, genuinely listening. A silver-haired man in the front row nodded thoughtfully. A woman in her 40s blinked rapidly, perhaps remembering her own literature teacher from years past. James Conroy wrote that Gatsby showed him that we create ourselves through what we pursue, Martin continued. He's a pediatric surgeon now. Said he thinks about that lesson every day. DiCaprio nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So this book isn't just a rare first edition, it's a record of transformation, of impact." "Precisely," Martin agreed. A tall man in a perfectly tailored suit approached, his interest piqued. "I collect rare books myself, but I've never considered their educational legacy." He extended his hand to Martin. "Gregory Hilston, I find this fascinating." Harrington watched this exchange with growing concern. The narrative was slipping from his control. What should have been a straightforward ejection of an unwanted visitor had become something else entirely, a referendum on value itself. "While these anecdotes are charming," the auctioneer interjected, "we have a room full of serious collectors waiting. Shall we proceed with the bidding?" "Actually," DiCaprio said, "I have a proposal." He turned to address the entire room, his natural charisma drawing all eyes to him. "This situation presents us with an interesting question about what truly gives something value. Is it market price, historical significance, or personal meaning?" The room hung on his words. Even those who had initially dismissed Martin were now fully engaged in the unfolding drama. "I suggest we hear the stories behind a few more of those signatures before we start bidding," DiCaprio continued. "Let's understand what we're really auctioning here." Harrington's face tightened, but he recognized the shift in the room. Several influential collectors were nodding in agreement with DiCaprio's suggestion. To shut this down now would alienate people whose continued business was essential to Blackwell's success. "A brief interlude, then," he conceded, with the air of someone granting an enormous favor. Martin carefully opened his wallet and removed a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of the book's dedication page with its constellation of signatures. He pointed to one near the center. Sarah Chen wrote that Gatsby taught her that we're measured by how we use our privileges, not by having them. His voice took on a note of pride. She became the first in her family to attend college, then founded a tech company that employs over 200 people. A striking woman in a midnight blue gown stepped forward, her expression intense. Sarah Chen of Pinnacle Solutions? When Martin nodded, she continued, I sit on a board with her. She mentions her high school literature teacher in almost every speech she gives about her journey. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The abstract had become concrete. These weren't just sentimental stories from an old man. They were verifiable connections to successful people whose lives had been shaped by his teaching. DiCaprio watched as the room's perception continued to shift. The book on the pedestal was transforming before their eyes from a valuable collector's item to something more complex, a nexus of human growth and potential, a catalyst for change that continued to ripple outward long after the final page had been turned. I believe, he said quietly to Martin, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, that we're witnessing exactly the kind of lesson you taught your students, that true value isn't always what we initially perceive it to be. Harrington's patience had reached its limit. With a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, he tapped his gavel on the podium. While these stories are certainly touching, we must return to the business at hand. This is, after all, an auction house, not a literary salon. Several attendees who had been moved by Martin's stories shifted uncomfortably, caught between social protocol and the unexpected emotional resonance of the moment. The woman in the midnight blue gown, who had recognized Sarah Chen's name, caught DiCaprio's eye and gave a subtle nod. I believe we're ready to begin bidding on Lot 47, the first edition of The Great Gatsby, Harrington announced, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. Bidding starts at $280,000. Do I hear $280,000? The room fell silent. Where moments ago hands would have risen eagerly, now there was hesitation. The context had shifted. It wasn't just a rare book anymore. It was Martin Thorne's book, filled with the aspirations and gratitude of students whose lives he had changed. $280,000, came a voice from the back. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses raised his paddle slightly. For my collection. Harrington visibly relaxed. Thank you, sir. $280,000 is the bid. Do I hear $300,000? Martin's shoulders slumped slightly. DiCaprio noticed and placed a steadying hand on the old teacher's shoulder. This isn't over, he said quietly. $300,000, called another bidder, a woman with a pearl necklace that could have funded a small school. $325,000, countered the man with the wire-rimmed glasses. The bidding continued, quickly climbing past $400,000, then $450,000. With each increase, Martin's expression grew more resigned. The envelope containing his life savings remained clutched in his hand, now a painful reminder of his inability to compete in this world. DiCaprio hadn't placed a bid yet. He watched the proceedings with an inscrutable expression, his eyes moving between Martin, the book, and the increasingly energetic bidders. $500,000, announced a new voice. Gregory Hilston, the man who had introduced himself to Martin earlier, entered the fray. $500,000 is the bid, Harrington confirmed, his earlier discomfort now replaced with professional satisfaction. Do I hear $525,000? The room had transformed again. What had briefly been a moment of reflection on the true value of literature and teaching had reverted to a competition of wealth. Several spectators who had been moved by Martin's stories now watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to resignation, as if witnessing an inevitable return to the natural order of things. $525,000, called another bidder. $550,000, Hilston countered immediately. Martin turned to DiCaprio, his voice low. Thank you for trying. I should go now. This was a fool's errand. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet dignity in acceptance. Before DiCaprio could respond, the bidding jumped again. $600,000, called the woman in the midnight blue gown who had recognized Sarah Chen's name. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. The book was now selling for more than double its expected price. I have $600,000. Do I hear $625,000? $625,000, Hilston responded without hesitation. DiCaprio finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Before this continues, I'd like to ask something. Heads turned toward him. What exactly are we bidding on? Is it just the book as an object, or what that book represents? The question hung in the air. Harrington frowned, uncertain where this was leading, but unwilling to silence a celebrity of DiCaprio's stature. Because if we're bidding on what this book represents, DiCaprio continued, then the value isn't just in its first edition status or its condition, it's in the lives it has changed. He turned to Martin. Mr. Thorne, would you say that book fulfilled its purpose in your classroom? Martin stood straighter, professional pride evident in his bearing. Many times over. Fitzgerald wrote Gatsby as a critique of empty materialism and the corruption of dreams. For 43 years, my students grappled with those themes and carried those lessons into their lives. The book did exactly what Fitzgerald intended. DiCaprio nodded and addressed the room again. Then perhaps what we're really auctioning is the right to continue that legacy. The room had gone completely still. Even Harrington seemed momentarily at a loss for words, the gavel motionless in his hand. I'd like to place a bid, DiCaprio said, but not for ownership in the traditional sense. He paused, ensuring he had everyone's attention. I bid $800,000 for the book to be returned to Mr. Thorne with the condition that upon his passing it be donated to Westridge High School's library, where it can continue to inspire students. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the room. Harrington blinked rapidly, processing this unprecedented turn. That's not, he began, but was cut off by another voice. I support that bid, and I'll add $50,000 to it, said the woman in midnight blue, with the same conditions. Hilston nodded thoughtfully. Count me in for another $50,000, same conditions. One by one, other bidders joined, not competing against each other now, but contributing to something new. Even the thin man with the wire-rimmed glasses who had opened the bidding raised his paddle. Another $25,000 from me. Martin's eyes were wide with disbelief. I don't understand, he whispered to DiCaprio. They're not buying the book, DiCaprio explained quietly. They're investing in its purpose, in what you've done with it. The total had reached over $1 million, all pledged toward returning the book to Martin with the condition that it would ultimately serve future students. Harrington had given up trying to maintain traditional auction protocols and was simply recording the pledges, his expression a mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. Finally, when the pledges stopped, DiCaprio turned to Martin. It seems the room has decided that the highest value of this book isn't as a collector's item, but as a teaching tool. Martin's hands trembled as he reached out toward the book, still on its display pedestal. All those years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I tried to teach them that Gatsby's true tragedy was valuing the wrong things, that wealth without purpose was empty. He looked around at the room full of wealthy collectors who had just contradicted every stereotype. It seems some lessons reach beyond the classroom. Harrington, recognizing the extraordinary PR opportunity unfolding before him, found his voice at last. Sold to the collective bid for Mr. Thorne and the future students of Westridge High School. As Martin finally held the book in his hands again, camera phones captured the moment from every angle. Within minutes, the story would begin spreading across social media, how Leonardo DiCaprio and a room full of wealthy collectors had transformed an auction into a lesson about the true value of literature and education. The auction continued with its remaining lots, but something fundamental had changed in the room. Conversations buzzed with discussions of favorite teachers, formative books, and educational legacies. Several collectors approached Martin, asking to see the signatures and hear more stories about his former students. The elderly teacher, who had arrived as an unwelcome outsider, was now the center of respectful attention. DiCaprio stayed by Martin's side as he carefully opened the book, turning to the dedication page with its constellation of youthful signatures, each accompanied by a brief, heartfelt note. The actor examined the handwritten messages with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions about particular students and their journeys after graduation. "This is the real treasure," DiCaprio said, his finger tracing the edge of a signature from someone who had gone on to become a playwright. Not the rarity of the edition, but the evidence of minds being opened. Harrington, ever adaptable, had shifted his approach entirely. What had begun as an embarrassing disruption to his auction had transformed into an opportunity. He was already crafting how Blackwell's would frame the evening's events in their press release, a celebration of literature's transformative power, hosted by their prestigious establishment. "Mr. Thorne," he said, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne, his tone now warm with respect, "Blackwell's would be honored if you would consider allowing us to host a special exhibition of your book before it returns to Westridge High. We could feature essays from your former students about the impact of literature on their lives." By midnight, the story had exploded across social media. Video clips of DiCaprio's intervention and the subsequent collaborative bidding were trending worldwide. Headlines ranged from "DiCaprio leads $1 million bid to return book to teacher" to "Gatsby himself would have been speechless," when an auction became a lesson. Education advocates seized on the moment, sharing stories of other transformative teachers and calling for greater support for public education. Several prominent collectors issued statements about starting initiatives to connect rare books with educational institutions, creating programs where historical texts could temporarily return to classrooms. Outside the auction house, Martin stood in the cool night air, the book carefully wrapped and protected in his arms. The weight of it felt different now, not just the physical heft of a rare first edition, but the weight of vindication and recognition. "I never expected any of this," he told DiCaprio as they waited for their cars. "I just wanted to hold it one more time to see those signatures again." DiCaprio smiled. "I think tonight was the most authentic Gatsby experience any of those collectors could have had. They got to see the emptiness of pursuing possessions for status alone." He nodded toward the book in Martin's arms. "And they got to experience the alternative, the joy of using wealth to preserve something truly meaningful." A young valet attendant approached hesitantly. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked. "I just wanted to say, my English teacher changed my life too. What happened in there tonight? It matters to people like us." 1 week later, Martin Thorne stood before a classroom of 30 students at Westridge High. On a special stand at the front of the room rested the first edition of The Great Gatsby, open to the dedication page with its signatures from a class long graduated. "Literature isn't valuable because it's rare or expensive," he told the wide-eyed teenagers. "It's valuable because it changes how we see ourselves and our world." This book was written nearly 100 years ago as a critique of empty materialism and the corruption of the American dream. Last week, I witnessed that message come to life in the most unexpected way. As he recounted the events at Blackwell's auction house, the students listened with rapt attention. When he described DiCaprio's intervention and the transformation of the wealthy bidders from competitors to collaborators, several students pulled out their phones to find the viral videos. The true legacy of any book, Martin concluded, is not who owns it, but who is changed by it. Fitzgerald would have appreciated the irony that almost a century after he wrote it, his novel about the emptiness of materialism would inspire a room full of wealthy collectors to value education over ownership. After class, as students filed out, one girl lingered. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, "would it be okay if our class signs the book too? Not to replace the original signatures, but to add ours? To continue the chain?" Martin smiled, feeling the full circle of his teaching life complete. "I think that's exactly what this book is meant for. Not to be locked away, but to connect generations through a shared story." In his Beverly Hills home, Leonardo DiCaprio watched one of the many news segments about the auction's aftermath. Schools across the country were reporting surges in donations of rare books and historical documents, with collectors increasingly specifying that the items should be accessible to students rather than secured in archives. He smiled, thinking of Fitzgerald's final line in Gatsby. "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." Some lessons, it seemed, were timeless, waiting to be rediscovered by each generation, if only given the chance.